Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, can airlines deliver summer highs? Why background noise at European airports has moved centre stage? And which leaders were recognised at this year's Airline Strategy Awards? My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper. Hi, Lewis.
Hi, Graham. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good. And it's been a super hectic period in the industry and for us with our Airline Strategy Awards, which we'll talk about after in the second half of the podcast, and with the IATA and the Paris Air Show. So it's been a little while since we've been on the pod, isn't it?
It has, yes. And obviously, but in broad terms, we've since we last spoke, I think we're starting to see the first obviously earnings from Q2, but also the first commentary on how things are going in the Northern Hemisphere summer. And that's certainly an interesting time again, isn't it, after what we went through last year?
Yeah, it's a sort of a slightly confused, well, not confused, but it's a slightly contradictory period. You know, the market is going very well for airlines on the one hand. They are still making money, where there's lots of talk of increased competition and challenges ahead. And traffic is continuing that rise up. And, I think IATA figures had passenger traffic, I think, within maybe 3% of pre-pandemic levels. So, that traffic return, that demand recovery, is definitely strong. And we are in the peak summer period in the Northern Hemisphere. And things are sort of holding up, but it's not without the occasional alarms and, pressures on disruption. We've seen that both in Europe and in North America, haven't we?
We have, yeah. So people are talking quite a lot about the industry normalisation. I think one thing to say, of course, is after 3 very unusual years, it's there is a degree of normality to some of the things that are happening. It was never unusual that summer peak particularly was a challenging time operationally for airlines. And as you say, the overall picture is on the financial side and of the performance spectrum is pretty strong. But yeah, there have been a few developments over the past few weeks that kind of perhaps put paid to the notion that this summer was going to be a smooth one, and everything last summer was lessons were learned and everyone was prepared, etc., etc. Some of the things that are happening are out of airlines' direct control. So as ever, there are plenty of stakeholders in this industry, and everything can't be put at the airline's door. And I think what we saw sort of early on in the summer season, I guess in the US with ATC challenges, weather challenges, that kind of thing, kind of fall into that bracket, don't they?
Yeah, very much so. In the US, in particular, had a very tricky holiday weekend. That was a major crunch period, and it is interesting. We talk about this normalization of the industry, and to some extent, the industry it is back to normal, and it was far from perfect before before COVID happened. All it's not new that Ryanair and others in Europe and even in the US, the airlines would be complaining about, air traffic control and disruption caused from that. It's certainly not new that the weather would cause major issues. Of course, we've seen some particularly acute problems over this summer, and clearly against the backdrop of climate change, that is something that feels like it's going to be an even more significant factor going forward. And even things like airport capacity, airports in Europe in particular, for example, they were constrained, they were congested before. So, those kind of operational pressures that you had were high beforehand. And so it's definitely true that as an industry, the airlines having a much better run at the summer this time around because they are better prepared. They are, in terms of staff levels at airports, at airlines, the staffing levels are much better. But, you still do have a kind of newly trained up industry. We have lost, quite a lot of experience from that. And the same pressures that were there before are largely there again. And, some of those other factors that are creating a problem around that, and within Europe in particular, when it comes to airspace, the extra pressure, and there are far bigger issues around what's happening in Ukraine. But the fact that the dispute in the Ukraine is still continuing, that has an added pressure in terms of Europe's ability to deliver the services it can as traffic comes back?
It does, yeah. So we know, on that topic, we know one of the challenges with ATC in Europe this year is airspace is much more constrained because of the loss of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian airspace. A lot more aircraft going through a smaller area. Add on top of that, of course, again, something that's not new, but strike action at ATC providers, on top of the fact that staffing shortages among ATC providers. You add those three things together, and it's creating some challenges, shall we say, always with the caveat that overall, I think most airlines would take where they are today versus where they have been in recent years. So yeah, they are significant challenges, and there's kind of a mixture really going on of these shorter term issues and longer term in terms of capacity constraints. So in Europe in particular, on top of those ATC challenges, we're also seeing moves to kind of more structurally restrict capacity. And I think that appears to be a growing theme for the industry. As you were saying, this wasn't an industry that was awash with capacity going into COVID. So as it reaches and exceeds, particularly in obviously the biggest market, so as it reaches and exceeds 2019 levels, fundamental changes, as we might be seeing in Schiphol, in Amsterdam, and under proposals for Brussels, for example, may mean that capacity constraints are a structural part of the industry for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing at Amsterdam in particular, that's a really interesting development, I think, a highly worrying one in many aspects for airline growth, I guess, but also one which, it's almost a year, I think, since the Dutch government first floated the idea of cutting capacity back at Schiphol Airport. And a year on, we're still not really clear where that's going. There's still plenty of uncertainties around that. Obviously, that there have been various legal challenges. Airlines and airports themselves both working on concepts where they can operate more efficiently. But of course, those are sort of long-standing ambitions, and they aren't easy to do. And then even, in that particular instance in the Netherlands, you had a situation where the Dutch government proposing it, now they've actually collapsed since then. So you end up in a situation where, there is no certainty as to how things go. And, and it's quite the economic impact and on cutting capacity in Amsterdam, for example, would be on KLM would be highly significant, would have a major impact. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops, or whether that's more of a transition of flights. But what's absolutely clear is that capacity at airports and capacity within Europe in particular is going to be under scrutiny going forward. And, to some extent, the easy part of the task, and it wouldn't have felt easy for any airline leader involved in doing this, the easy part of it was getting back to pre-pandemic levels of traffic. Actually managing to grow in that environment is altogether much harder.
It is, particularly, as you say, when you're concentrating on the big hubs. There are clearly more underserved markets than maybe some of the lower cost carriers are able to tap in this continue a relatively aggressive growth. But when you're looking at the most attractive and busiest hubs, the room for growth is less obvious, and it always has been, but perhaps even more so. And of course, for an industry that knows there's going to be a lot of investment ahead to reach net zero, the idea that certain carriers could be facing reductions in the amount of flying they can do from their key airports is very significant, and doesn't exactly create an environment where you're motivated to stick to investment plans. It's kind of puts you in quite a defensive position, I guess, as a business, if you feel that governments are either proactively or even discussing, as in the case of Brussels, where the transport ministers floated the idea of again, like Schiphol, a noise-related cap on flights. In both cases, it does create a lot of uncertainty for the industry. It's fundamentally, I guess, different issues to the shorter-term operational disruptions, but all of this kind of comes under this heading of constrained capacity, and it's an interesting time at the moment. I think North America, as we talked about, has had ATC has been a challenge there with staffing shortages again. And it was notable that United Airlines was one of the airlines that struggled the most at points with maintaining its schedules when there was weather disruption. They're particularly noteworthy because Scott Kirby had talked about foreseeing that the industry would have these capacity constraints going forward, and that it meant it needed to be better prepared for what was to come in terms of making sure it had spare capacity, spare staffing levels so that it could cope with trouble when it came along. But of course, even in that case, when you felt that someone who had made quite a big play of noticing this situation, his airline had quite significant struggles over a few days relating to disruption. It just goes to show that maybe there's only so far you can prepare for these things. And also it does reflect to an extent, I think, some of the outdated IT and software that underpins some both airline operations and ATC operations, that things tend to fall over a bit too easily, particularly when things go wrong. And as you say, we are living in a world where you have to look in Europe at the moment with the wildfires in Rhodes, for example, which is generating a lot of headlines with airline cancellations and rescue flights, to see that maybe we're heading towards a future where these things are going to be more commonplace until the global economies get a grip on climate change. So going back to the point, this is just looking at financials, it's looking pretty good this summer. But yeah, as I said earlier, anyone that thought this was going to be plain sailing has been proven wrong in many cases, I think.
And because there is continuing, and it's another contradiction, of course, an industry which is ordering, a string of new aircraft, which sees, if you talk to any airline CEO, one of the first things they'll talk about sustainability, probably because it's the most, what they would imagine is the most controllable thing for them, which is to bring in new aircraft, update the current fleet, which, certainly as a near-term measure is probably the biggest step change an airline can make in terms of addressing its environmental impact. That, of course, is not as easy to make happen as they would because of the entire supply chain issues, which have caused engine maintenance, not just engine maintenance, but general maintenance problems around the current fleet, supply shortage and delivery delays. It means actually you're seeing, airlines are having to returning aircraft which we hadn't expected to see back again, or operating older aircraft. So Lufthansa had already brought back their A380s earlier in the past few days. Etihad had just returned its A380s onto the London Abu Dhabi route, and that the primary benefit of that is that they have a route between London and Abu Dhabi which they think can support that larger aircraft. But it's as much about releasing capacity onto other destinations so that they can grow using the fleet they have while waiting for new aircraft to come in.
This is it. There are plenty of airlines out there who I think he will openly say they wish they were able to fly more in the current environment, which obviously for some, when we're talking about these operational challenges, is perhaps not as straightforward as it may have been, because clearly the system in some cases is struggling to cope with the capacity as it stands. But yeah, as you say, it's these aircraft that are being brought back into service does reflect a market for aircraft, whether they're new or second-hand, leased or purchased new, is incredibly tight. You talk to some chief executives and they'll tell you that they've effectively been gazumped when trying to secure leased aircraft, for example, thinking the deal was done, and then the current operator, for example, will suddenly decide they want to keep it and will pay a lot more than they were, or essentially, the better offer will come along and they lose out. So it's a weird dynamic, really, where airlines probably would like to operate more, but there's also an extent to which you think, well, it's probably lucky they're not in some cases, because clearly there are capacity constraints in several areas.
I think one of the challenges for this industry in multiple forms is, a lot of the solutions are really difficult to make happen. So, no one disputes the potential for air traffic control through the implementation of single European sky, which would be, fantastic operationally and also from an environmental perspective. But, no one would also doubt that there's been, very limited success in implementing that over the past 2 decades or so. Circumstances could provide the catalyst, perhaps. Maybe things have to really get stretched before politicians will make the decisions necessary to kickstart it. But in many cases, the solutions to some of those crises, similarly, new airport capacity or new sustainable types of aircraft, they're all a few years away. So it does feel as though, on the one hand, I think Willie Walsh and IATA will be absolutely delighted that one of their biggest complaints this summer is about an old school issue in terms of air traffic control and disruption. That after given what they've had to complain about, that's a great position to be in. But it does feel as though we've had these few years of dealing with COVID, and now it's back to this industry still has many fundamental issues to tackle if it's going to become operationally. It's going to be able to thrive operationally and to grow, I guess.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, obviously, you talk about coming out of the last 3 years, and clearly one thing that most people acknowledge coming out of the COVID crisis is that sustainability is now kind of the first item on the agenda of any industry conference you go to. And I do think when we're talking about operational challenges and expansion of airport capacity, and solutions involving, investment in ATC, whatever, it does need to be placed in the context of this being an industry where scrutiny of its growth is itself growing all the time. And it all feeds into the same narrative, really, where, unless the airline industry can prove it's on a path to genuinely on the path to net zero, these challenges are going to be harder to fix because the political optics of investing in lots of expanded airport capacity, etc., are going to be harder for political parties to pull off, particularly in talking from Europe, where I think this issue is most pertinent. But certainly that type of concern is likely to only grow in other regions as well. So has always been challenging. There is an argument where getting the investment needed might get harder in some cases because of that idea that it is not a good look to be seen to be encouraging the growth of aviation. But that's not to say there are plenty of politicians who also can balance that against the clear benefits that the industry brings. But I think it is a reality that the industry has to face, alongside the reality that operational challenges are probably going to get more frequent and sometimes probably harder to deal with if climate change, does continue to have an effect on weather and all the problems that can cause, and also on, as we mentioned earlier, on wildfires and things that mean that destinations suddenly become unservable, or you need to get your customers out, and then beyond the obvious devastation that can cause, from an airline point of view, there's costs and all sorts connected with that. So it's an interesting time. No one's unaware of these challenges, but I think so much these days comes back to that sustainability argument one way or the other.
So no shortage of challenges for airline CEOs at the moment. After the break, we're going to look at some of the standout achievers among airline leaders at our recent Airline Strategy Awards. Welcome back. We have a regular awards event that we run together with our partners, Corn Ferry. Every year we held our most recent Airline Strategy Awards event in London earlier this month. And Lewis, this event kind of recognises leaders across a variety of regions and disciplines.
Yeah, so we changed things a bit this year. I think previously we've kind of focused more on business models, but increasingly, obviously, we know in the industry that those models are blurred, and we were finding at times, but too much of the debate was around who fits into what category. So we kind of shifted to a regional focus for the main leadership awards across the 5 kind of big airline regions. So we combined Africa and Middle East into one. We've got North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And have I missed one there?
I think that was all of them. Europe, North America, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and the Middle East and Africa. And there were a number of standout performances there. Singapore Airlines won in the Asia Pacific region, and that really was recognition of, incredibly impressive financial results, but also the speed and acceleration and their readiness with which their leader, Go Chun Fong, had set the airline up for when they did reopen borders. We recognised Ben Minakuchi, Alaska Airlines, and that's a very strong holistic story. Alaska Airlines operated very impressively, I think, coming out of the pandemic, and it's accelerated its fleet transition, built on its alliance membership of One World, and that's allied to a really impressive approach to ESG and sustainability, and so there are very strong players in Latin America and the Caribbean. JetSmart, which was the winner there. That's a very interesting airline.
Yeah, we often find with the smaller carriers, I guess you often get a neat narrative. So yeah, in this case, yeah, JetSmart, nowhere near the size of some of the bigger players in that region. But I think the sense among the judges is that it really belied its size with its impact, and I think it's only around 20 aircraft at the moment, but it's really making a success of being a pan Latin American ultra low cost operator, which is no easy task at the best of times. We know from covering that area of the world that being an airline in that region is challenging. There are lots of regulations between countries. So while we're used to being in Europe, for example, which has a kind of single aviation market, and whereas I guess in North America you have the huge domestic markets, in flying between countries in Latin America is not easy, and the also carriers in that region face higher costs on fuel in some instances through taxation and things that makes it tough. So on top of that, JetSmart kind of started up in Chile in 2017, but fairly quickly after that we obviously entered the pandemic, and so they kind of had to start again almost coming out of COVID. And they've got operations now in Argentina, as I mentioned, Chile, Peru. I think they're opening up in Colombia. They're kind of making a success of the idea of serving markets where people previously would have spent 30 hours on a bus, but they're really making a success of that, and that's no easy task. I think we've seen even the last few months carriers struggling and ceasing operations in that region, but it's backed by Indigo partners, so who we've heard from before at the awards, not least I think Bill Franke picked up an award just before the pandemic. But yeah, it's a really good story under Estuardo Ortiz, their leader there, and they've making a success really of operating across multiple countries, and small operation but so much potential, I think, and it's just a really, really nice story and a strong one from that region.
And one of the things we tried to do with the slightly different structure of the awards was to maybe shine a light on some airlines and stories that don't necessarily get that, or might be a little bit under the radar. And another of those was the winner in the Africa and Middle East category, which Roger Foster, who leads Airlink, and Roger Foster's been running that airline for many years, but that airline went through a sort of a major transition just ahead of the pandemic, and not even because of the pandemic. I had a long-standing franchise agreement with South African Airways, but when South African Airways came into its financial problems, Airlink was faced with what happens to those routes that would be given up, and it had an opportunity to branch out on its own, start operating them on their own and in its own right under its own AOC with its own brand, and it has acted really swiftly in doing so, and in quite sort of difficult circumstances, trying to do that during the pandemic. Got that up and running by the October of 2020. I think its positioning has been very clever. I think it's a subtle change from being SA Airlink to Airlink, but sufficient that it controls its own destiny, and operating was a really difficult market. The South African market had a huge amount of overcapacity, which is one of the reasons domestic players there struggled so much. And of course, another long-standing player, Comair, ceased operations as well. SAA's low-cost unit, Mango, has grounded as we speak still. So it's a really difficult market, but Airlink has grown really, really cleverly, operating within South Africa itself, but actually predominantly in regional routes around the market, using a fleet of Embraer regional jets. Operates, I think, more than 60 of those now. In Europe, we had an interesting winner there as well, I think, Lewis.
Yeah, so Europe, it was Pegasus CEO Güliz Öztürk who picked up the Executive Leadership Award there. Pegasus, interesting carrier. I think they're around 100 aircraft now, based out of Istanbul's second airport, but with obviously smaller bases elsewhere. Not quite the same story, I guess, market-wise. I think obviously Turkey as a whole going into COVID has had some challenging times. But coming out of COVID, I think, and during COVID, obviously a large domestic market was fairly helpful for its airlines, but also I think the weakness of the lira has made it quite an attractive leisure destination. On top of the fact, it's obviously an attractive leisure destination anyway because of its large resorts and particularly for European travellers. So Pegasus, often maybe in the shadow of Turkish Airlines, but it's certainly come out of the COVID crisis strongly. It was great to recognise Güliz Öztürk. I think the Pegasus talk about her being a pioneer among female leaders in the Turkish aviation sector. But it's not just her appointment that's significant in that regard. She is very much an advocate for diversity in the business, and in her previous role as commercial chief at Pegasus, she'd been heavily involved in trying to for mentoring schemes for women in the business and making sure that the terms and conditions for female employees were right for ensuring they can work to their full potential in the business. So she was recognised by IATA this year, I think, in that regard, in the awards around diversity. So she's a really interesting leader in that regard. I mean, she's been leading Pegasus since May last year, and I think in that time they've had some really impressive financial results, the strongest EBITDA margins in the whole industry, I think, last year. I mean, granted, there are reasons around, I think, currency why helps it towards that, but certainly there's a really strong underlying operational performance there, a really good story around ancillary revenue, which is clearly a really important thing for those low cost operators. Yeah, and then obviously after Güliz Öztürk was chosen for the award, they announced an order for more aircraft, so they're really ramping up their growth. And so they've got really interesting business there, and it felt like a really good opportunity to celebrate what they've done there in terms of, as I say, a relatively new leader, but a really strong story in recent months. And probably a slightly longer term story, as it often is the around the Airline Business Award, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. We every year we recognise a leader for a kind of sustained effort, a sustained contribution to this industry, and this year it was Doug Parker. Up until very recently was chairman of American Airlines, but most famously, spent 20 odd years at the helm of what became American Airlines today, but through two reverse takeovers, starting at America West and then through to US Airways, and then to create American Airlines as it is today. And I think it's an incredible achievement. I think it's easy to get lost in the largely highly successful consolidated US airline industry, the giants of Delta and United and American Airlines, and in fact even Southwest has used consolidation. Alaska, we're seeing it with JetBlue, potentially with Spirit as well. Before that consolidation happened, US carriers, it was a struggle to do that, and to deliver the kind of profits that this industry now, and certainly the US market, delivers, a sort of a kind of level of profitability that probably wasn't ever anticipated that airlines could achieve. Doug Parker was really central to that mission. I mean, it's an extraordinary story of taking that leadership of to carry out two reverse takeovers as essentially the smaller guy, bigger operator, and to take over and lead that company, and to carry out those mergers and transitions remarkably well. It's financially a very stable airline. I mean, Doug Parker, interestingly, he a few years back he was asked, and in an interview he said that he thought that American Airlines and airlines, the US carriers in general, wouldn't lose money again because of that consolidation that they had made. I don't think anyone could have seen COVID coming, but it's certainly, if the never losing money again didn't demonstrate itself, I think the speed with which the US carriers have recovered, and American certainly among them, illustrates the journey I think those consolidated players have been on. So great to have Doug Parker there in London to collect and receive that award. There were 2 or 3 other winners we have. Cargo, that award went to Atlas Air, didn't it, Lewis?
Yeah, so Atlas Air, they've recently had a leadership transition. So we had Michael Steen in the room, which was great, and the award recognised John Dietrich as well as the previous CEO up until a couple of months ago. Obviously, Dietrich has since been announced as CFO of FedEx, but yeah, a really strong story with Atlas Air. They're one of the largest cargo carriers in the world. They've really diversified the business, which I think, seeing the massive volatility in air cargo just over COVID really reflects why I think that's an important move by the business. So yeah, just a really, really strong leadership story there, which has culminated this year in Atlas Air going private, and a sense that the huge value created by that business is reflected in that move to going private. So a great story there. Yeah, and we had on the ESG side, we had Air New Zealand picking up the awards. Lots of, I think, fairly well known work there on the ESG side, particularly sustainability, around work on new aircraft programs, for example, and commitments to targets on their net zero journey. And Volaris on digital, wasn't it?
Yes, and so Volaris they're really a leader on digital. They have been right from the outset of kind of a central mantra of that business. And once again, when the judges were very impressed with the way they had used digital since the pandemic, in particular in terms of both growing revenues through its app, a new relaunched website, which had a tremendous effect on that, and also its digital resolution for passengers, when there are challenges in their flights. And that disruption management is a really key play for airlines. And I think you see, Volaris is a really good example of where they've actually used it as a way of not just a cost saving, because it's a cost saving if you can find a way of digitally and automating that process, but also a way of actually improving customer service. And I think you see that across the industry with different players who are, I think anyone who's faced disruption on a flight will recognize when they've had good and when they've had bad treatment, and when things have worked and when things haven't. And I don't think the industry is where it needs to be yet across the board, but you can see when it is resolved sort of painlessly and simply and in an automated fashion, you really can see the value of digital going ahead there. And I think Volaris are a super strong player in that field. So all those stories you can read far more about at flightglobal.com. But other than that, I think that's all we have time for this week, isn't it, Lewis?
I think so, and I'm fairly sure next time we speak, we'll be looking at some of those disruption issues in some specific circumstances as we have a look at some of the earnings calls from the second quarter period, I think.
Yes, absolutely. So that's all we have time for. A reminder, you can read all the stories that we covered and talked about today at flightglobal.com. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter, which you can sign up for free, again at flightglobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like us, review us, tell your friends, subscribe, and we'll speak again soon.